Our next presenter, local artist, Rebecca Poulson.
Thank you. I wanted to know about the decade of 1867, 1877 in Sitka, and my main question was how it was that the Tlingit people had really controlled this area in the Russian days, but by the end of the 1870s, they were impoverished and marginalized. And so my question was what happened during that decade? And most of these images are by Edward Muybridge, who was here in Sitka in August of 1868. This is an image of Lincoln Street. You can see the church for reference. So Army records and first-hand accounts show that the Tlingit people were highly integrated into Sitka's economy in the American days. For example, when the steamer John L. Stevens came into port for the transfer, Tlingit people came out to sell them fresh food. Tlingit people sold food, they cut firewood, they did other work for the Americans, and there was a curfew, but during the day they were free to come through the stockade and work, buy or sell things, or to sit and observe. So right after the transfer, there was a flurry of activity as the Russian-American company assets were sold off, and one sign of the optimism was that there was a consent city government formed in December 1867. The Army troops brought drunken crime and mayhem to Sitka by officers and enlisted men alike. In May 1869, enlisted men even robbed the cathedral. Crime ebbed and flowed through the decade, but between October 1868 and March 69, there was an average of 26 military offenders a day in the guardhouse. The Russian-American company paid the fare for anyone who wanted to leave, and more than 500 Russians did. In 1868, this is a picture of, you can see the blockhouse. There's a blockhouse now in about that same spot. For reference, that's about where the Pioneer Home is. In 1868, the Army had established a total of 5 posts in Alaska, but in 1870 had closed them all except for Sitka. The city government faltered and failed due to lack of funds. Sitka's population fell. The Army was supposed to be temporary, as it had been elsewhere in the West. California, Oregon, Nevada, and Nebraska were already states in 1867. But in Alaska, the immigration never came. And by early 1869, the U.S. government was virtually the only economic activity in Sitka, and the once-a-month steamer was subsidized by post office contract. In the 1870 census, 3 years after the transfer, the population still included about 1,200 Tlingit people, but on the other side of the stockade, other than the Army, there are only 390 persons, down from the 900 or so at the time of the transfer. 250 of these had been born in Alaska, 21 of these people in Russia. Most of these people were the Creole, people of mixed Russian and Native heritage, mostly Alutiiq and Unangan, and these people were usually called Russians after the transfer. Poverty in 1860 was so bad that the Army actually gave rations to nearly half of the Russians in Sitka to prevent starvation. And a sign of the desperation is a total of 37 of the Russian women were listed as prostitutes in the 1870 census. And this building was called the Double Decker, and this is where many of the destitute Russians lived. So why didn't Alaska get a rush of immigration and investment like other parts of the West? And one reason was it wasn't needed because there was so much land already available. The other reason was the economy. The main industry was the fur trade, which was not doing well, in part due to overhunting, but also due to a post-Civil War recession, the Long Depression that lasted through most of the 1870s, and a depression extended to Europe as well. The fur trade was the dominant industry in the northwest coast, maybe the only industry, and had been since well before the transfer. And Native people were producers, but the big profits were when they acted as middlemen, controlling access by other natives to trade goods. And a major impact of the international trade was epidemics. Smallpox had swept the coast pretty much every generation. In 1775, in 1802, there was a huge epidemic, 1836-37, where hundreds of the Tlingit here by Sitka died. And again in 1862, that affected mostly people further down the coast. It's hard to overestimate, I believe, the impact of epidemics. And I think it's agreed that depopulation was probably the major factor in the defeat of indigenous tribes across the Americas. So the lucrative sea otter trade was pretty much over by 1820. So the Russians established New Archangel in 1804, but because of chronic shortages of personnel and resources, they never really controlled more than the immediate site of New Archangel. And the Russians had intricate relationships with the Tlingit people, as we heard earlier this morning. They purchased furs from the Tlingit and also tons of food like halibut and venison. They employed Tlingit people, and many Russians had relationships with and even married Tlingit women. An illustration of a little of this complex relationship was when in 1831 the company extended the fence around the larger New Archangel, and one benefit, according to the governor at the time, was to keep the Tlingit from selling alcohol to the Russians. And they had to pay a lot of attention to diplomacy with the Tlingit, and when a Russian governor allowed relations to deteriorate in the early 1850s, he was criticized and removed from his post. But his neglect of diplomacy led to a Tlingit attack on the fort in 1855, in which 5 or 6 Russians were killed and dozens were wounded. So the Russians had to pay careful attention to diplomacy and regularly paid Native people for injury that was done by Russians, even when it was accidental. The Hudson's Bay Company began expanding into the coastal region in the 1830s, and leased a fort from the Russians at Wrangell, and the Russians had to regularly intervene between the English and the Tlingit to keep the peace. The clans who controlled the trade routes to the interior at the Stikine River, which is Wrangell area, and Chilkat, which is Haines area, were wealthy and powerful players in this regional fur economy, and clans defended those rights by forcing the Hudson's Bay Company to abandon trading posts up the Stikine River in 1838, to abandon a post at Taku in 1842, and above Chilkat on the Yukon in 1852. So in the 1850s and 60s, more and more British and American colonists were coming into the Northwest. Tlingit people traveled to Puget Sound to trade and to work for and to interact with the white settlers, as well as with other tribes. In the mid-1850s, thousands of northern Indians, including Heiltsuk, Haida, Tsimshian, and Tlingit people, gathered each year at Fort Victoria. While in the 1840s, the Tlingit were selling their sea otter pelts to the Russians, after 1851, they took those furs 1,000 miles to Victoria to trade. So in British America, the British Navy enforced gunboat diplomacy, and they burned villages, they destroyed canoes if there was, what they felt like was issues. And in the United States, it was just as violent as Native people were systematically forced onto reservations. And so Russian America was almost a de facto haven of native control. In 1856, and an illustration of this, there was an incident in 1856 when Tlingit people from Cape were on the beach at Port Gamble in Washington. They were ordered to leave, they didn't, and the USS Mississippi fired on them, killing 27, including an important clan leader. The survivors asked for compensation from the authorities, did not get any. So the following year, relatives made the voyage down to Puget Sound and killed the collector of customs at Whidbey Island as someone with comparable status to the clan leader, and returned to Russian America. By the 1860s, the Russian American Company was still dependent on the fur trade in spite of their efforts, so they were losing money. And they were also concerned that Americans would swarm into Alaska the same way they had into the American West. And those were two big factors in their decision to cede their claims in 1867. And so what changed for the Tlingit economically and politically with the transfer? So on one side of the stockade, the Russians, formerly dependent on the Russian American Company, were starving. On the other side, Tlingit people weren't starving, but they were losing ground economically. So I ran into so many myths in doing this research, and one commonly held myth is that that subsistence, just living off the land, was enough, and it wasn't in this period, because there was nothing keeping Tlingit people from fishing and hunting for themselves, but just getting food wasn't enough. They were completely integrated into the economy, into the larger international economy at the time. So American traders were aggressively displacing Tlingit from what trade there was in the fur trade. In an 1870 report to Congress, a Sitka businessman wrote that on Kuyu and Kukrinaw, the natives, quote, catch some furs, besides trading with some of their neighbors. Their trade has fallen off considerably since the occupation of the territory by the Americans. They formerly were in the habit of getting their trading goods from small crafts from Victoria, but at present the Indians north, south, east for 200 miles either come to Sitka or get their wants supplied by the small crafts that load or are owned by Sitka merchants. So the Indigenous trade in the 1870s centered on Port Simpson, which is not too far south from the border. And at various times, the customs collectors considered imposing tariffs on goods that was coming in by canoe, but they never really pursued it, and it might have been because of the relatively small quantities. It was gold prospectors, backed by the military, who broke the Tlingit trade monopolies, first on the Stikine River and then on the Chilkat route. The only law in the Army period was the 1868 Treasury Act, which established the Customs Service. So the Army had responsibility of government, but no actual legal authority. And the Army commanders were constantly trying to figure out what their authority was, and they're always frustrated because they really didn't have any. There was literally no law. Congress ignored Alaska. Civil government would have been expensive, and as it was, the costs of supporting the Army and the customs and the monthly steamer cost more than they were getting back from customs. And the United States was in a depression. So the Army's biggest concern was always keeping alcohol from the native people, and this would be a topic in itself. And then when there was a ban on alcohol imports, there was a huge rise in distilling by natives and non-natives, with molasses imported by the barrel, by the shipload. And when the Army commander in the mid-1870s sent some alcohol sellers to Portland for trial, the judge decided the Army did not have the authority to jail civilians and threw out the case which led to those alcohol traders suing the army commander for false arrest. So right after the transfer, the Kikseti leader, Mikhail Kukhan, who we've heard about in, I think, all three of the previous presentations, initially refused to take down the Russian flag in front of his house. American accounts tell how the Tlingit and perhaps Kukhan complained that even though they had allowed the Russians to stay in their territory, they didn't intend them to give it to anybody else who came along. And Tlingit leaders from other clans, when they met with General Davis to invite trade relations, told General Jeff Davis the same thing. They did not recognize American claims. Tlingit law requires compensation for an injury or a death, even if it's accidental. And traditionally, this was a life for a life of equal status. But throughout the Northwest Coast, this was commonly negotiated in material compensation. In early 1869, an army sentry killed men leaving Sitka by canoe. This followed an incident when General Davis entertained clan leaders at New Year's, 1869. Chilkat Kagwantan leader Koklux, or Kolchek in Jeff Davis's rendering, was insulted by a guard when he went through the stockade gate. He grabbed the soldier's rifle and walked off with it. There was a violent confrontation when soldiers were sent in to apprehend him. And 2 Tlingit men were killed, a soldier badly wounded. Koklux gave himself up. General Davis had him put in jail. And there was an order following this incident that people couldn't leave Sitka. But it apparently wasn't in effect when a sentry killed some men who were leaving. Relatives of the men from Cape repeatedly tried to meet with Jeff Davis to talk about compensation, but he repeatedly refused. These relatives then killed 2 Euro-Americans who were camping at what is now called Murder Cove on Admiralty Island. And this led to the first of 3 incidents in which the U.S. military attacked native villages. This was the so-called Cape War, when the USS Saginaw shelled 3 villages and burned all of the houses but one to the ground, a total of 28 clan houses, and many of them were 30 or 40 feet square. They also destroyed canoes. The Cape incident was repeated at Wrangell later the same year, 1869, after soldiers killed 2 Tlingit men after one of them assaulted a woman at the fort. When the victim's father retaliated by killing a white merchant, the army shelled the village of Kakkan'ak. Then, when he gave himself up, summarily tried and hanged him. So the Americans didn't always treat the natives unfairly, and one of the deaths at Sitka in 1869 of a Chilkat man was compensated by a merchant who paid in blankets. He not only wanted to prevent violence, but the Chilkat refused to come to Sitka to trade until it was resolved. General Davis himself, later in 1869, when an army policeman shot and killed a Tlingit youth, paid the family to prevent a white person being killed. And the army punished petty criminals regardless of race, putting them all in jail together. There was never any organized resistance by the Tlingit. And the army was never, we see this again and again, they were never afraid of the Tlingit. The brutal retaliation was to put down insolence. Again and again, you see references to a saucy or an insolent Tlingit leader. The retaliation was to demonstrate the overwhelming authority of the United States. And the most striking thing in reading documents from this period is this virulent stereotype of natives as savages. This was the era of manifest destiny, literally the height of the Indian Wars, and the height of racist justification for taking native lands. Natives are passive and lazy. They are shrewd, greedy, treacherous, brutal, and untrustworthy. And yet every American observer who's making this stereotype records experiences and interactions that contradict every aspect of this portrayal. And I think the heart of this stereotype is that Native culture is so primitive that mere contact with civilized culture, and especially alcohol, is enough to break it. And this stereotype lays the blame for Native poverty on natives and their inadequate culture. So I believe there were three main factors in the Tlingit loss of power over this decade. One was the declining fur trade and being pushed from their central role in it. The second factor is deliberate subjugation by the US military and officials, driven by this racial stereotype. And the third was the high mortality from introduced diseases, exacerbated by poverty. And so the transfer brought an acceleration of what was already well underway in the Pacific Northwest. The Army pulled out of Alaska in June 1877. The US government was cutting back on the military, and they needed all the available men for the Nez Perce War. Sitka Tlingit immediately began to take apart the stockade to salvage the contents and occupy village government buildings, and just to generally assert their right to be on the other side whenever they wanted to, and even demanded and got compensation from a merchant for a death that presumably was from alcohol. Alaska was left to the Treasury Department, but there were only 3 revenue cutters on the entire West Coast, and one of those was patrolling the fur sale grounds. So alcohol imports were banned, but there was no law controlling molasses or allowing destruction of stills. And from August to November 1878, Portland merchants shipped 4,889 gallons of molasses to Sitka. In 1879, this was 2 years after the pullout, the non-native Sitkans, claiming they were afraid of a Tlingit attack, sent to Victoria for a British warship for protection, and the alleged threats were by Kiksadi leader Kotleon demanding compensation and wages owed for the deaths of 5 Kiksadi men working on a whaler. The HMS Osprey responded, and the American government stationed a US Navy ship at Sitka. In 1879, the commander of the Jamestown found 360 US citizens living at Sitka, of whom 34 had been born in the United States. But by the end of the 1870s, so obviously I'm getting past the decade of the 1877, by the end of the 1870s, the national economic depression was over. The first canneries were built at Old Sitka and at Kasan in 1878. Visitors started to come in the late 1870s, and there was an actual tourist cruise to Glacier Bay in 1882. But a large gold strike in 1880 at what is now Juneau is what put Alaska on the map. These new industries had limited opportunities for Tlingit to participate, and backed by the government, they took native land and resources. Tlingit still suffered devastating losses to disease, in common with other impoverished groups in the United States, even as most Americans were seeing increased lifespans. So the first Protestant missionaries in Southeast Alaska were Tsimshian at Wrangell in 1874, but Presbyterian Sheldon Jackson took the opportunity to send missionaries and teachers to Wrangell and then to Sitka in 1878. And from the earliest days of American occupation, Tlingit leaders had been asking authorities for schools. And by 1879, naturalist John Muir and Presbyterian missionary S. Hall Young reported that every village they visited, with but 1 or 2 exceptions, was interested in missions and schools, having heard of the work of William Duncan at Metlakatla in Canada. The Tsimshian Christian community of Metlakatla was the most famous, but there are also Methodist missions and the major mission sites at Sawmills, There was a cannery at Metlakatla. There was an enormous church, and they had nice frame-style houses. So the invitation in Missionaries by the Tlingit probably had been in part to get sawmills and prestigious frame-style houses, and to, I think, and maybe to regain some of the economic ground that they had lost. Anthropologist Arl Kraus visited the Tlingit at Chilkat in 1882 and reported that after they had gone to church for half a year and sent their children to school, they went to the missionary and complained that they had not been rewarded for their virtue and had not received boards to build their houses as the Tsimshian had. Which isn't to say that Tsimshian or Tlingit were not sincere, but economic opportunity was probably part of the attraction of Protestant Christianity. And some of the earliest students at Sitka included young men of standing in Tlingit society. And the Sitka mission saw rapid success because of the early support and the dedication and drive of these first students. So the missions promised some empowerment, but they were operating on that same stereotype the military had, that Tlingit culture was the problem. They believed they were helping Native people by getting rid of Native culture and language. And so natives who joined the Presbyterians had to make a deliberate choice. In spite of their sacrifice, Native Presbyterians were still subject to racial bias, poverty, and high rates of early death. In 1882, the revenue cutter Corwin destroyed most of the village of Angoon over a protest by Angoon Tlingit demanding, you could probably guess, compensation for a death of a man employed by the whaling company. And in contrast to the shelling of Cake in 1869, the destruction of Angoon was condemned in Congress and in newspapers, although Angoon residents had to wait 100 years to get even an apology. So that incident was part of what led to, finally, 17 years after the transfer, Alaska got some civil government with the 1884 Organic Act. And Sheldon Jackson's missions success, thanks to these incredible early students, gave him quite a big voice in framing that act and on education policy in Alaska. The U.S. government even provided monetary support for mission schools into the 1890s. They excluded the Russian Orthodox Church, which Protestants considered decadent and superstitious. Nevertheless, by the late 1880s, the Russian Orthodox Church at Sitka grew rapidly with Native converts. And this could be because this church allowed much more Native control than the Presbyterians did. And who knows, if I have sort of an economic thesis, it could have partly been because of the limits of what the Protestant church could deliver as far as economic mobility. So the dynamics of the decade of 1867, 1877 led to Alaska we know today. High rates of death, subjugation by the government, economic marginalization, all driven by that stereotype of weakness of Native culture, put incredible, enormous, sometimes insurmountable obstacles in the path of people identified as Native. So the problems, by looking at history, we can see that problems Native population have now have nothing to do with Native culture, and those problems are because of what happened to this particular population. And I think learning about the history is really important so that we can, that stereotype that there's something about Native culture that's holding Native people back it's persistent, and you see it, and once you see it and it's in this form from 150 years ago, you start to see how it lingers today, and I think the only way we can kill that stereotype and make that separation between the problems and Native culture by bringing that stereotype and the history into the light. Thank you.